Thank you very much, Chairman. We always have an interesting discussion in which one side of the committee only looks at one side of the ledger, and that's the coal economy and the fossil fuel industry economy. Many of us have different economies that are paying the price of carbon pollution. My colleagues have heard plenty from me about this over the months and years, so let me bring in a couple of other voices. Here's one. In late 2014, fishery regulators announced that for the second consecutive year, there'd be no shrimp fishery in the Gulf of Maine this winter. The culprit, principally warming ocean waters caused by global climate change. The author goes on to say that the lobster has been disappearing from its traditional habitat in southern New England and described a phenomenon that scientists dubbed an ocean heat wave in the spring of 2012 that led to an early molt and migration of lobsters that caused a supply glut and subsequent price collapse. The author goes on to say the message here is clear. Climate change is taking dollars and jobs away from New England's fishing communities. Generally, she says, fish species off the northeast United States are collectively moving to higher latitudes and deeper water in search of the cooler temperatures they require to survive, and we certainly see that in Rhode Island. She adds the more dramatic potential for dramatic storm surge events in which higher sea levels combine with more intense weather activity to increase flooding and storm damage, and we certainly have already experienced that in Rhode Island with Sandy. The author comes to the conclusion that what is needed is, to quote the piece here, honest, fact-based discussion and a genuine bipartisan commitment to solutions. And the author of that article is none other than our former Republican colleague in the Senate, Olympia Snowe. Another voice that has come out recently comes from The Economist magazine. The Economist magazine is a very conservative publication, but it inhabits the space where it is at once conservative but not under the control of the fossil fuel industry. And here's an article that they posted recently. I'll be quoting from it. The coal, electric power, and automotive industries, if the coal, electric power, and automotive industries had had their way in the early 1970s, American cities would look like Chinese cities today. The 1970 Clean Air Act triggered the same kind of hysterical industry denunciations we are seeing today in response to the move to force the electric power industry to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Among them were Ford claiming that the 1970 Act quote, could cut off automobile production in just 5 years, lead to huge price increases for cars even if the production were not stopped, and do irreparable damage to the American economy. Again, in 1972, when the industry was being asked to adopt catalytic converters, General Motors threatened, quote, complete stoppage of the production line, and the president of Ford said that it could cause Ford to shut down. In 1974, when we were acting on sulfur emissions, the American Electric Power spent $3.1 million on an ad campaign to convince that installing scrubbers on coal-fired power plants would be a disaster. The article continues, needless to say, this was all nonsense. America's GDP has grown 212% since then, while emissions of traditional air pollutants fell by 68%. Adult mortality in the United States would have increased by 160,000 in 2011, that's dead people, adult mortality. In 2011 alone, over the course of 40 years, the Clean Air Act's pollution reductions have quite literally saved millions of lives. The author then goes on and describes what he calls a fairly reliable pattern. Whenever the government considers environmental or safety regulations, manufacturing and energy companies and industry associations put out, quote, studies, close quote, that grossly overestimate the costs and understate the benefits. In retrospect, the industry response to environmental regulation in the 1970s can best be described as mendacious, homicidal, greedy, whinging, which is Brit speak for whining. He concludes here, the fact that the carbon which utility companies churn out is gradually cooking the climate. And when considering the industry response to stronger greenhouse gas limits, one should keep in perspective that in the past they have been laughably wrong, and that the positions they have advocated would have led to the deaths of millions. In the struggle for clean air, executives in the power, mining, and automotive industries made fools of themselves at the time by cooking up economic and scientific arguments against pollution regulations that turned out to be utterly wrong. It is infuriating to see them now cough up the same tired, half-baked arguments against carbon emission limits that they have been making wrongly for 4 decades against the whole slate of government environmental and safety regulations, the very regulations that have made America the cleaner, safer country we know it to be. And I take that statement from, again, a conservative publication. This is not the publication of the Sierra Club. This is the Economist magazine, as showing that there is room for a principled, conservative position that acknowledges the reality of climate change, that acknowledges the reality of what's happening in my state. I'm keenly aware of what the economic damage could be if we get this wrong in West Virginia and Wyoming, in Arkansas and other states. And I'm willing to work with my colleagues to try to see what we can do to get that right. But I cannot have a situation in which the other side refuses to acknowledge the reality of what is happening in Rhode Island, of what is happening in Maine, of what is happening in Oregon, of what is happening around the world and around the country, because carbon pollution, to use the economist's phrase, is cooking our environment. And that doesn't even get you into what it's doing to our oceans. You can actually go measure sea level rise. You do that with the equivalent of a yardstick. You can go and measure the warming of the ocean. You do that with a thermometer. This stuff isn't complicated. You can go and measure the acidification. You do that with essentially pH-type tests that people use for their aquariums. This is not complicated. And when you measure it, you see it happening. It is real. We are in the process of having the ocean acidify at a faster rate than has ever occurred in the history of our species. Now, if you never want to go near the ocean, and if you never want to eat anything from the ocean, and if you don't think that the ocean provides anything useful in terms of oxygen and cooling for the planet, that may be a matter of no interest to you. But it's pretty significant, because when you go back into geologic time to look for the previous occasions, when you've seen that sort of calamitous change in ocean acidification, and you look at what's happening on the rest of the planet, those were not the high points for planetary habitability. So I support this rule wholeheartedly. I urge my colleagues to look at both sides of the ledger, not just the fossil fuel industry side, and with any luck, in a reasonable amount of time, we will be able to do the job in Congress that if we'd done it in the first place, you might not be here having to answer these questions. But because of our failure, you've had to proceed, and I don't think it's fair to blame you for having to proceed when we're the ones who have failed.